Everyone listening to this podcast has been a patient of a doctor at some point or another. And when we go to the doctor, we have to give our informed consent to being treated in a variety of ways, whether they're going to take that test, use our blood for this or that, whether they're going to perform some operation. We have to provide our informed consent. And when doctors attempt to get our informed consent, it's not just a check mark so that they don't get sued, although it's, of course, that as well. Getting informed consent is the healthcare system's mechanism to provide us, the patients, with a crucial opportunity to exercise our autonomy. When we exercise our autonomy, we make decisions about our healthcare with a variety of values and preferences in mind. One of those is, of course, our medical goals, like I want to be able to walk again, or I want to be able to run again, or I want to be cured of cancer, or whatever it is. But there are other kinds of considerations that come into play. So, for instance, we might think about whether the timing is right for that surgery. We might think about whether the approach to our illness is sufficiently aggressive, or maybe it's too aggressive. We might wonder whether treatment is worth it at all, or we should just carry on. Do I really want to get that shoulder surgery, or should I just do, PT and hope that's sufficient? My guests today, one is Rune Nyrup. He's an associate professor of philosophy at Aarhus University in Denmark, and the other is Jeff Keeling, a senior research scientist at Google Research and an associate fellow at the University of Cambridge. They're both worried that informed consent is under threat by AI, more specifically by the potential for doctors to use AI in a way that I don't want to say eliminates our informed consent, but at least mitigates it, detracts from it, or maybe I should put it slightly differently. It's not that it mitigates or dampens or lessens our informed consent, although it may do that too, but more generally, it decreases our autonomy and our capacity as patients. Their concern is really motivated by three claims. The first is that a crucial component of informed consent is that a patient understands the various options and trade-offs in relation to their own personal individual values and preferences. And they get that understanding in part through their doctor. So, for example, a couple of years ago, I had to have reconstructive ACL surgery. And the doctors said to me, look, you could use a part of your quad to make a new ACL. You could use a part of a corpse to make an ACL. Here's the pros and cons for these kinds of things. It depends upon what you plan on doing after the surgery. Are going to go back into sport? How aggressively you go back into it? And so on and so forth. So I got to make a certain kind of decision about what kind of procedure I wanted or how I want that procedure to go in light of my personal goals, preferences, values. And I was able to make that kind of decision because the doctor informed me of those kinds of things and the trade-offs that are involved. Again, first thing, a crucial component of informed consent is that a patient understands the various kinds of trade-offs at play. The second thing is that large language models don't provide true explanations for their recommendations. So an LLM may say, yeah, you should use this sort of corpse ACL, or it might say, for this cancer, you should take this course of treatment, so on and so forth. But they can't explain to you or to the doctor why they're giving that recommendation. Relatedly, that means that, and this is the third thing that we need to keep track of, the third major claim of Rune and Jeff, LLMs can't properly understand and incorporate those individual preferences and values into the recommendations that they give. Doctors can't understand the kinds of trade-offs the AI is at least implicitly making in giving the recommendations that it is. And as a result, the doctors can't give an explanation to the patient what the trade-offs are. So imagine that an LLM said to the doctor, yeah, for this patient, they should use the ACL of a corpse to reconstruct Reed's ACL. And then I say, why that? And they might say, we don't know why it recommended that one. But that would not be good because that doesn't properly account for the kinds of things that I'm trying to get out of this medical intervention in the first place. So because the LLMs can't incorporate my own values, the doctors can't understand the way in which my values are at play in the recommendation, and as a result, I can't make a fully informed decision, and my general autonomy as a patient is thereby decreased. Okay, those are the three big claims that I think are motivating them. One, a patient needs to understand their values, and they make trade-offs in determining the medical course of action they want to take. LLMs can't explain their recommendations, and LLMs can't take into account our values in coming up with recommendations that it does. Okay, so much by way of introduction. I'm Reed Blackman. I'm the host of Ethical Machines. Now, if you like this podcast, please subscribe to it if you haven't already. Give it a 5-star review, write a thing, share it with your friends. Just do the things that you're supposed to do when you like things. And if you got any questions for me, trenchant criticism, recommendations, please email me at em@reedblackman.com. All right, thanks so much, everyone. And now let's go talk about patient autonomy and AI. So one thing that I find really interesting about your work is that it takes place at the intersection of two core moral concepts or ethical ideas, one having to do with healthcare and one having to do with AI. So in the healthcare space, everyone listening to this has been a patient, and everyone, it's amazing, really, almost everyone knows the phrase informed consent. They know that in order for doctors to do anything to them, they have to first provide informed consent. And that's phenomenally ethically important because we know that there have been historical cases like the Tuskegee experiments where terrible things were done because there weren't requirements around informed consent. So everyone's familiar with that and how ethically important it is. And in the world of AI, many people are familiar with the demand, or at least the frequent request for explainability. We want to know how these AI systems work. And you cover this interesting intersection of these two big ideas. How does the explainability issue intersect with getting informed consents from patients, given that doctors are using AI tools? So that's a lot to explore. But before we dive headlong into that, I wonder if you could say a little bit about some of the use cases for AI in healthcare. So how are doctors using AI in such a way that we've got to start worrying about issues of explainability and informed consent?
For sure. So I guess one plausible starting point is to say that AI can influence healthcare at different layers of the healthcare stack. So at the fundamental biomedical science level, you might have a model such as DeepMind's AlphaFold 2, which essentially predicts 3D protein structures based on amino acid sequences. And that model has the potential to speed up biomedical science. It has the potential to speed up drug discovery. And there are certain explainability demands that you might want in that context to enable scientists to leverage the technology to benefit patients. But you can also have, at a much higher level, clinical decision support systems. So you could have AI systems that, for instance, help clinicians with diagnosis or treatment recommendation or risk assessment. And those models have very different explainability demands in that they intersect with clinical norms like informed consent or shared decision-making.
So is this one of the sort of the major use cases that have been talked about in healthcare since ChatGPT 4.0 came out, is this using it for differential diagnoses? So you ask the LLM, hey, here's my patient, here are their stats. Maybe you upload a report, a medical report or an MRI or something. You can ask it various questions. What's super interesting, or among the many interesting things about that potential use case, is in principle, or at least the way that some people talk about it, the LLM or ChatGPT, whichever one you're talking about, it's all the doctors. It's a geneticist, it's an oncologist, it's a pediatrician, it's a whatever, all the things, epidemiologist, geneticist. And so you get potentially an answer or response that beats the average, most any other doctor who has the single or maybe double specialty or something along those lines. So that does seem to be super high risk, but also extremely promising.
It's an updated version of a thing people have been trying to do with AI in medicine for a long time. Specifically, differential diagnosis generators have been around since maybe early 60s. The first experiment started with this. And so people have tried to do this idea of inputting all the medical knowledge, different ways of doing that, right? But building a system where you somehow build in all the medical knowledge you have. So you're not relying on any particular individual doctor's expertise, but it's programming either in an old-fashioned way where you hard code the knowledge, or in more modern ways where you try to use maybe natural language processing to extract it. So this has been done before we had LLMs. And these systems were, the idea is you give the patient symptoms and what other information you have, and then it would give you, based on our background knowledge about the frequency of various diseases and how they correlate with various symptoms, a list of the most likely diagnoses that this could be. And sometimes it would be supplemented with a red flag if it's something that's particularly urgent that the doctor check up on.
Is this software more like a decision tree? If 35, then yes. If under 35, then no. And then you just work your way down to the list of plausible diagnoses. And which is, if that's the way it works, and as long as the decision tree is not too complicated, it's readily explainable how you came to the conclusion that you did. So is that the way that the software worked before? Now, of course, with LLMs, there's basically zero explainability as far as I can tell.
Yeah, so a couple of points on that. So the earliest diagnostic models in medicine were Bayesian models that employed statistical information to make inferences on the basis of relevant features of the patient. Slightly later models then used decision trees, so they were logic-based models where you could give if-then explanations. Large language models are the most recent iteration, and to be honest, it's not models like GPT-4, rather it's fine-tuned models like MedPalm or MedPalm 2, which take a language model as the base model and then fine-tune it on clinical information to give more specific clinical capabilities. But I guess one interesting contrast between the two is, unlike in the logic-based case where you can give a simple explanation in terms of logical rules as to how the diagnosis was reached, in the language model case, you have this choice between two kinds of approaches to explainability. So on the one hand, you can get the model to explain its own diagnosis. So the model might make a particular recommendation based on the patient's history. And then you can say to the model, please explain your diagnosis. And it will give you a set of steps as to how it got there. But that's a kind of post hoc rationalization of what happened. And it doesn't actually give you an account of how the model computed the original output on the basis of the input prompt.
I called this the deliberation problem in an article that I wrote, where I said exactly the sort of thing where you ask it, how did it come to that conclusion? And it will come up with something. But LLMs they don't create conclusions on the basis of evidence or on the grounds that, right? It's very complicated next word prediction. And so even when it's giving the explanation, all it's doing is predicting the words that would most likely cohere with what's come before that, which doesn't mean that it bears any causal relation to why it gave you the output that it did, in this case, why it gives you the diagnosis that it does. So it strikes me as particularly dangerous because not only is it a black box, not only is it unexplainable, but it also pretends as though it's not, confidently. And since I feel like this is a relatively subtle point, 99% of people not going to get this, that it's not forming judgments on the basis of evidence. So that brings us to how this intersects with informed consent. So suppose I say something like this. All right, you seem to be worried about informed consent. I want to hear the case for why it's a threat. Doctors use all sorts of tools to help them do all sorts of things. Patients have no idea how those tools work. And then the doctors say, we're going to run this test, and are you cool with that? Yes, I'm cool with that. They run the test, you've got informed consent, and that's the end of it. Why should I think that there's anything different going on here? Why should anyone think there's anything different going on here such that the use of a large language model that is large enough to be unexplainable, or at least with current technology, current methods, why does that introduce a new problem with regards to informed consent?
Yeah. The analogy you're drawing with other kinds of medical technology, I think, is on point. Sometimes when the explainability problem is posed, it's as if it's a problem that the patient doesn't understand some very complex piece of technology that's involved. We have fMRI scanners, we have complex lab experiments that underpin clinical decisions, and the doctors hardly understand those themselves. If they understand them, they only learned about a long time ago. Once they're in the clinic, they'll just be
a radiologist may have no idea how an X-ray machine, works at the physics level of things, if you like, but they know how to read an image.
Yeah, exactly. So understanding the technology itself is a bit of a red herring in this context. Again, there might be other contexts where that kind of explainability is important, but that's not what we think the problem is in the case of clinical reasoning. Rather, what we worry about is the effect it will have on the decision-making process itself when you're dealing with a complex system, and especially a system that's complex in the way where it allows the doctor to offload a lot of the cognitive work that they would normally go through when making a diagnosis. That's a complex point, but maybe to unpack a bit, it might be helpful to start by saying a bit about what informed consent is.
Yeah, I want to hear about informed consent, and I want to hear a little bit about, just a quick point, I take it that clinical reasoning just is reasoning about what kinds of medical problems this patient may have. Is that what's meant by clinical reasoning?
So it's that, and it's the kind of reasoning that goes into making clinical decision. So one kind of decision is deciding what do we think the right diagnosis is. There are also decisions around what kind of further testing to make and what kind of treatment to administer.
Sure.
And often there's a trade-off between those where you could try to just decide what the diagnosis is now, or you could try and make some more tests. Or you could just apply a treatment right away, or you can decide that nothing is wrong. And all of those decisions, because you're under time pressure, you sometimes have to prioritize them. So in the background, you have to make reasoning about it.
So then your general view, if I understand this right, so we've got two things going on here. Number one, we've got clinical reasoning by the doctors, and we have patients who may or may not provide informed consent. And one, we need to get a clear view of what constitutes informed consent. I think you think that. I'm going to ask about why in a second, because it just seems, we know what it is. And once you're informed meaningfully, you understand what's being said, you would consent to it, off we go. One question that is looming that you've raised is, there's something complicated or interesting about how we think about informed consent, so I want to hear about that. And then I take it that you think there's something about the way that LLMs work, or that they might work with doctors such that it potentially undermines, I don't know if that's the right word, undermines their clinical reasoning in some way. Or let me be more specific. I take it you think that it undermines clinical reasoning in such a way that then informed consent gets undermined. Is that the picture?
That's roughly correct, yeah. Maybe if we zoom out slightly and just start with an overview of what informed consent is and why it matters, and then we can dig into where exactly the tension lies. So consent is part of everyday morality. There are lots of things which are presumptively wrong, but which you can consent to make them right. So, for example, it's presumptively wrong to have sex with people, but consent can make it okay to have sex with people. It's presumptively wrong to inject people with needles, but consent can make it okay. So the general function of consent in morality is as a kind of waiver. It defeats these presumptive wrongs.
Yeah, sure. I was at jiu-jitsu this morning where I try to choke people and they try to choke me, but it's okay because we consented.
Exactly. There's a bunch of things that would normally be wrong, which consent can then override. Informed consent is a specific way of making sense of this idea of consent as a waiver of people's rights. So the thought is that, other things being equal, in a medical context, it's permissible to perform a medical procedure on someone or to make any kind of medical intervention only if and because the person gives informed consent to that intervention. And there are lots of exceptions to this. It might be the case that if the person lacks the capacity to give informed consent because they're a child or they're in some way incapacitated. But the thought is, other things being equal, so long as the person is in a position to give informed consent, then the intervention is permissible only if they can give informed consent. What does that consent then consist in? In the standard view, there's 3 parts to it. So first there's what's called the preconditions for informed consent. So the patient's consent needs to be voluntary, in the sense that it's not coerced, and the patient needs to be competent to give consents, in the sense that they have the relevant mental faculties in place to understand what kind of thing is being done when they give consent. Then there's what's called the information conditions. So the thought is that the patient has enough understanding of the decision they're making and the considerations relevant to that decision to actually make an informed decision about it. And then finally, there's what's called the consent conditions, which says that the patient needs to autonomously authorize the relevant course of action. So the thought is, if you have all of these conditions together, the preconditions, the information conditions, and then the consent conditions, that's enough to defeat any kind of presumption against the wrongdoing that the doctor would otherwise be doing. So that's informed consent. Then the question is, how is it that informed consent may come into tension with opaque machine learning models used for purposes like diagnosis or treatment recommendation? And the thought is something like this. When a doctor employs a machine learning model for diagnosis or for treatment recommendation, they offload part of their cognitive labor onto that model, and that lessens their understanding of the relevant inferential relations that concern the patient's case. What it is about the patient that led the doctor to infer that a particular treatment was a good recommendation for the patient, the doctor will have a less clear picture of those kinds of inferences. The problem is that if you take the sort of general spirit of informed consent and respect for patient autonomy, it matters that the patient's beliefs and values are a kind of central part of the decision-making process. And the worry is that the doctor is less able to take into account the patient's beliefs and values and less able to explain what's going on to the patient so that they can make an informed decision if part of the cognitive labor is being completed by a model that the doctor doesn't fully understand, where particular model predictions might be such that the rationale for the model's prediction is unclear, or the values on which the model's prediction is based is unclear.
All right, so let me make sure that I get this right. Look, my attempt at summary. So part of informed consent, crucial part, is the informed part. They've got to be informed. They've got to know the facts. The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, roughly speaking. They need that if they're going to actually provide meaningful consent. Otherwise, it's consent under false assumptions, and we don't want that. Especially when you're trusting the doctor to give you everything that they should plausibly know, something along those lines. Okay, and so how does the patient give informed consent? They're informed by the doctor of what their options are, what the reasons are for treating them this way rather than that way, so on and so forth. What the potential impacts of the disease unfolding are, what the potential side effects, all the things. So you trust your doctor to give you the information. That's the informed bit, and then you can give the consent if you want, or as opposed to informed, what's lack of consent, refusal.
Refusal,
something like that.
yeah.
Okay, and then I guess the idea is something like the doctor, if they're getting a lot of their information from the LLM about here's how you should treat this person, or here's how you should treat this patient rather, or here's the potential diagnoses, if they're getting it from that, then they don't understand enough. There's some set of facts they don't know, because they don't know how the conclusion was arrived at, I take it, such that they can't then transfer those facts to the patient for them to be informed, and thus if they're not informed, they can't provide informed consent. So that's the hiccup?
Yes, so maybe a way of putting it more very succinctly would be to say the problem isn't so much that the algorithm itself is opaque, although it is. The problem is that by relying on it, the reasoning process becomes opaque. The process by which the doctor comes from the initial set of circumstances that are observed to a final treatment recommendation, that process becomes opaque, and so they lose access to some of the facts that they're supposed to be transferring to the patient as part of the decision-making process in informed consent. And
so they don't know them. I guess the idea is something like they themselves, the doctors themselves, don't know the justifications for the recommendations.
Yes. And quite crucial point here concerns what kind of values motivate certain kinds of medical decisions. So in informed consent, the standard for what is it you need to understand, you said the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, but obviously there are too many truths in the world for us to give patients all of them. So the relevant standards are the material facts, both the facts that the patient would consider relevant to that decision, things that they would want to know. And the common sense test is, if after you took the decision, the patient realized there was something you didn't tell them, and they would become upset by not knowing that thing, then it's something you should have told them.
Let me try a sort of thought experiment and see what you think about it. Suppose I've got this, it's a magic box. Forget about AI. I just got a magic box. And I found it, I'm a doctor, and I found out that every time there's 2 buttons on it. Every time I hit button A, my patient is magically cured of whatever disease they've got. Every time I hit button B, it expedites their demise. And maybe I was reckless. I'll stipulate I was reckless in the testing of this, but now I know. I've done this like 1,000 times. I go to patient number 1001, and I say, listen, I've got this box. It seems to be a magic box. It's got 2 buttons. Every time I hit A, my patients are immediately cured. Every time I hit B, they very quickly die. I'd like to hit button A for you. Can I do that? Now, I have no idea how this thing works. It's a magic box, right? I want to say, in this scenario, and you can tell me the scenario is not relevant or something along those lines, but I think if the patient says, you've tried it 1,000 times and button A always cures, yes. You don't know how it works? No. All right, I'm in. Let's do it. Hit button A. That seems to me like a case of informed consent, although there's not much. I guess maybe I'm going to start interrupting myself, but what do you think about that kind of case? Is that a case in which there's not genuinely informed consent? Is that case sufficiently disanalogous from the LLM case such that it's totally irrelevant?
Okay, so I think what matters here is to understand that there's a trade-off between different values. So one of the values at stake here is utility. So one thing that matters in medical decision-making is how useful the tool or the intervention or whatever is. And it's obviously the case that other things being equal, the more reliable a particular system is at diagnosing or producing good treatment recommendations, the better, other things being equal. But there are other things that matter in the context of clinical decision-making as well. One of those things is that patients are able to meaningfully inform the clinical process by their own values and the things that they care about. So to give a simple example, it may be the case that in order to find out what condition a patient has, the patient would need to go through a series of invasive tests. And it might be the case that the patient has a preference for not undergoing those tests because the patient has other kinds of priorities and they don't want to undergo a series of invasive tests. They'd rather spend their time doing something else. And that's fine. And the clinical decision-making process has to weigh up these different sorts of considerations. And the risk in saying, okay, I've got some sort of oracle black box that's going to tell you the correct diagnosis or tell you what series of tests you need to do to find out what the patient's condition is, that you risk overlooking these other sorts of considerations, like what the patient's preference might be. Whenever you make a clinical decision, you have to take into account a bunch of different factors and then make some kind of plausible judgment on the basis of those factors. And what the standard bioethical model tells us is that the best way of going about that is in a way where doctors are transparent with patients about the kinds of considerations that matter from a scientific point of view, and patients are transparent with doctors about what matters from their point of view. And then the thought is together they might work through the problem to come up with a solution that the patient is happy with.
Maybe I can also add a point. So the magic box case, it's not so much that it's disanalogous to the way that LLMs would be applied. It's more that it's quite disanalogous to the way most actual clinical decisions look like. So in most cases, we don't have a magic cure that either kills you or cures you. And so in that case, it's artificial because in that case, the patient's values are very obviously going to prefer one option to the other, except in, obviously, some very tragic cases, most people prefer to live rather than die. But most medical physicians, and many of the interesting ones, have some kind of trade-off where here's an operation. If it goes well, you will now be able to run again because we fixed your knee. But if it doesn't go well, you'll have a bad knee for the rest of your life.
Yeah, sure.
And so, which do you prefer? Some patients might say, running is really important to me. I'm going to take that chance because if I never run, that's really going to be a huge disruption to my life. For other patients, they don't want to have the risk of having a bad knee for the rest of their life. And that's going to vary by patient to patient. So if you have a system that just says, you should just take this operation. Why? It's the right treatment. And that reasoning about why is it that the right treatment is, that's okay. That's what they would change.
Yeah. Let me slightly alter the example or something like that. One of the things that I said earlier was that one of the things that's so promising about LLMs for the purposes of diagnosing is that it brings, I know this is not quite right to say, but I'm just going to say it this way. It has such a wealth of knowledge because it's been trained on all the data relating to all the medical specialties. And when you try to vet the results of these things, it's really difficult because you can't just have a doctor vet the result because they don't have enough specialties. So you got to get a team. You got to get literally dozens of doctors vetting these outputs to see whether they're reasonable, good, true, whether it works, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, it seems that on the condition that the thing has been tested quite well, in a variety of circumstances at least, you might say, we don't really know how this thing works. I'm a doctor with a single specialty, and here's my patient, and they've got limited resources. They've got limited time. The hospital has limited resources and time. I'm inclined to treat them in way X, recommend or diagnose them with X. I've consulted the LLM. The LLM says, actually, Y is much more probable. I have to say that the LLM, quote unquote, knows way more than I do because it has all the specialties. Maybe now I go to my patient and I say, listen, here's the deal. The really quote unquote smart LLM with all the specialties thinks you've got Y and recommends a certain course of treatment. I don't understand that. I think you've got X, so I recommend a different course of treatment. Who do you want to go with? Which do you want to go with? And then would it be a case of informed consent if they said, oh yeah, I'll go with Y, I'm going to go with the LLM? Or would the informed consent be undermined there?
My own view, I'm not sure if we're going to hold this view as well, but my own view is that if the circumstances were as you've characterized them, it's fine. I think that is the most information that's available to the patient at the time. If they have that information and make an informed decision off the basis of that information, then there's no issue there.
Yes, it might be worth at that point to then bring up autonomy, because that's really the value that's supposed to be, or the principle that's supposed to be motivating informed consent. So informed consent is, most bioethicists don't think that it has some kind of intrinsic value in and of itself. Rather, it's supposed to be promoting a different principle, which is considered, and it's the benefit of being intrinsically valuable, which is the principle of respect for autonomy. So the idea there is that as a liberal idea around that people should be in control of their own lives, they should be able to decide what kind of values they want to pursue in their own life, and people shouldn't be interfering with those kinds of choices, at least not, again, without then authorized with their giving consent. But the practice of giving consent in the clinic is about putting patients in the best place that they can be to make the choices that will allow them to pursue the values that they want to prioritize. And so in the case you gave there, sure, the requirement of informed consent is satisfied because the doctor is giving the best information available to the patient that they have, and they're informing them, amongst other things, look, this is this very complex system I don't understand, and it tends to work really well. And so you're satisfying informed consent, but behind that, because the quality of information you can offer to the patient is now much of a lower quality, it's more opaque to the patient. Why is this supposed to be a good treatment? Why? Then you're losing something on autonomy. The patient is in a poorer position to decide what kinds of values they want to pursue in their life. So if I could only tell you, look, this seems to be the right decision, but I don't know what makes that a good decision.
One kind of information you can give me in order for me to provide my informed consent is information about the justification, that is to say, the rational justification for the conclusion. So here's the evidence upon which the judgment was based. That's a kind of information you could provide me with that would help me to provide informed consent. But I take it that in lots of cases, you don't need that kind of thing. So now we go back to the comparison with non-AI technology. So we go back to something like whatever, X-ray and MRI, or just pick some medical test I don't even know the name of, that my blood has been run through that I don't even know about. I give my informed consent to have that thing done. The doctor didn't give me any sort of rational justification for using that machine. Doc, how does that work? I don't know. Some really smart engineers with medical backgrounds were able to put this thing together, so I don't know how it works. So another kind of information upon which I can base my informed consent is information about, like, how well this thing tests. It tests really well. Its results are consistent and reliable. It consistently scores better than the other doctors. So I'm giving a rational justification for why to use the thing, where the thing outputs, instead of like a green light for the blood test versus a red light, it outputs a, you've got cancer, or whatever it is. Hopefully not with the sort of like cheery AOL, you've got mail voice, but put that to the side. That's a UX problem. So one rational justification is you could trust this thing because it's been so tested. And in order for me to get informed consent, why do I need the rational justification for the conclusion, in the sense that I've got evidence that the conclusion was based on, as opposed to a rational justification for trusting a piece of equipment that has been shown to be reliable and consistent?
One thing to say here is that the system's judgments are unlikely to be value neutral. For example, if you have a diagnostic tool for cancer, the way it will likely work is that a machine learning model produces a risk score, and then that risk score is either above or below a particular threshold. And then if you're above the threshold, you're predicted to have the relevant condition. If you're below, you're predicted not to have the condition. Where the threshold is situated makes a difference to the number of false positives and false negatives that the model is going to give over a large population. And thus, where you put the threshold makes an implicit trade-off between the comparative ethical importance of false positives and false negatives.
Sure.
And it might be the case that in a given patient situation, that where the particular threshold happens to be situated is in some way relevant to that. So if you consider, for example, like medical screening for cancers, it might be the case that over a large population, a particular medical screening tool is rolled out, and predictably there's a given number of false positives in the population. For those people have the anxiety associated with getting a false positive. They have to go through certain tests and so on. I think that the point here is that by taking into account patient autonomy from the beginning and understanding that the kinds of procedures that you put patients through and the kind of information that you give them, like, all of that depends ultimately on what the patient's values are, what their preferences are for the kinds of clinical procedures that they undertake. And the worry is that you can't just have some kind of neutral model which works really well, which can be evaluated independently of the patient's preferences. The patient's preferences are themselves relevant to evaluating how well the model works, because things like the relative probability of a false positive or a false negative are relevant to the patient's clinical experience.
That all sounds not unreasonable, but we don't do that with anything else. Patients don't get to have a say in how they want the false positive versus false negative, etc. rate to be, where that threshold should be for any other tests, any test they undergo. Every test has false positives and false negatives, but they don't get to decide upon something like, what's the accuracy rate of this test? So why should we think that we need it in the case of AI to get informed consent?
I mean, it's an open question in medical ethics whether it should be the case that patients have input on that question. For example, Jonathan Birch and Katie Creel have argued that patients should have control over where the threshold is in classification problems. I'm not saying they're right, I'm just saying it's a plausible view.
Yeah.
But that sort of view, according to which, in order to get informed consent, a necessary condition for informed consent is that the person play a role in deciding whether or not to use the test in light of their own values with regards to the false positive, false negative rates of the tests, et cetera, et cetera. In 99.9% of the cases, we're not going to get informed consent. I don't think most people, first you got to explain to everyone the notion of a threshold and where false positive, false negatives are. And maybe you've got more confidence in the average patient than I do, but I think that's, to be completely blunt, beyond the intellectual reach of a great many patients to understand, let alone come to a well-reasoned conclusion about such a thing. If that's what's required for informed consent, we're just not, it's just an unreachable goal.
We're talking about a technical language, and then of course it ends up sounding difficult to understand. But in an ordinary clinical encounter, there's lots of conversations with the doctor that's about the doctor trying to figure out what's important to you, what is it that you want to get out of this thing. And then they're going to interpret the kind of values that you express in ordinary language, which we do all the time, right? Doctor, my knee hurts and I don't want it to hurt anymore. And then the doctor says, look, we could try and do this test, and if it's positive, we could have this kind of treatment. Now, that's not certain to work, but if it does work, we could make it go away. You communicate those things, and I think a good doctor is able to do that. Of course, that requires the doctor to have a lot of background knowledge that is a lot more complex, that the doctor then has the ability to translate into everyday language.
Yeah. To give a simple example of that, I tore my ACL doing jiu-jitsu, actually. I wasn't getting choked at the moment, but I tore my ACL. Needed to get reconstructive ACL surgery. And part of the conversation with my doctor was, what do you want to do afterwards? I mean, do you really need an ACL for your lifestyle? Answer, most definitely. Do you want to go back to sport? Are you not going to go back to that kind of activity? And so what my plans were post-surgery were relevant to what kind of surgery I would get. So I absolutely see the purpose or the function, the importance of those kinds of conversations that clinicians have with their patients. One thing to say, though, of course, is number one, it might be the case that LLMs can be trained to have those kinds of conversations. Putting that to the side, though, it can be the case that doctors input that into the prompt of the LLM in determining what the course of action is. So I do think that those kinds of things are foldable into the LLM assistant.
Okay. So now we'll go back to the thing you started off with in the beginning, right? So the problem is that, at least in the standard way of prompting an LLM to explain its reasoning, if that's not connected to the decision it's actually making, then it's just going to be sham explanation. So you might input all that information into the model, and then afterward, when you then ask it, then why did you recommend this particular surgery, it might cite back to you those things. But if that's not actually what it has been optimizing for in reality, then you're getting something that's worse than the doctor saying, oh, I actually don't know.
Yeah.
It's something that's actually actively misleading you into accepting a treatment based on reasons that are contrary to the ones that you wanted to prioritize. That would be worse than just poor involvement. Then that would be straightforward deception, essentially.
So where are we then at the end of the day? Look, if the LLM is giving bad outputs, it's continuously recommending either things that are just medically dangerous straightforwardly, or making recommendations that are contrary to the values of the patient, this stuff should be jettisoned, right? But let's take a case in which the LLMs really are functionally very good. That their outputs are, for whatever reason, whatever the explanation, they happen to be quite good. Maybe even better than the average doctor or better than the best doctors or something along those lines. But their performance is, let's just say, remarkable. But there's this threat to informed consent. So where do we land now? I know you talked about a little bit about utility, but there's also this informed consent thing. I guess my question is something like, what's the recommendation then about how to best proceed? I'll grant you, at least for the sake of argument, that you've outlined a plausible way in which informed consent gets undermined or at least weakened, mitigated, something, let's say weakened or dampened, if not completely undermined. Let's grant that. But we've got this, by stipulation, very useful LLM. Where do we go now? What do we do with this?
Yeah, I think a couple of points on that. One, I think it's plausible that current LLMs, or if not current LLMs, next generation LLMs, will be capable of engaging in sophisticated kinds of clinical reasoning and will be capable of taking patient values into account. Like, I don't want to rule out that possibility. I think that's plausible. Can those LLMs then be integrated into clinical pathways to deliver care alongside clinicians? Yeah, that also seems plausible to me. Do the questions of how exactly should we fine-tune LLMs with supervised fine-tuning or reinforcement learning with human feedback to provide the right kinds of explanations to patients to maximize the respect given to their autonomy? Do those questions go away? Absolutely not. And I think it's very important to take these questions about, okay, how does clinical reasoning typically work? How is it that clinicians factor in patient values? And then use those kinds of questions to inform how it is that we fine-tune the models for particular clinical contexts.
There's always going to be, I take it, some reasoning going on in future generations of LLMs that the doctor is not going to fully understand, right?
Yeah, so I think that's going to be the case, and I don't think that's going to be a problem in and of itself. And it's only a problem, again, if it creates the opacity of the rationale behind the decision, not just the evidence behind it, but also the kind of value trade-offs that are implicit in that decision. I'm not saying that's necessarily going to be the case. We're not proposing that it's necessary that relying on an LLM are going to make those kind of trade-offs opaque. It's just if you don't take care to design a system and test that it's not doing that, then there is a big risk that it's going to happen. So our argument isn't so much jettison the technology, don't use it because it violates this inviolable principle. It's just there is the value that we to make sure that the systems don't undermine. And there's a risk that they do if they're not designed properly, if we haven't made sure that they integrate the patient values in the right way. And we need to ensure that the explanations they return then also are reflected in the kind of trade-offs they in fact are making.
But so take a case in which, by your lights, it hasn't been designed correctly. It doesn't offer true explanations for how it comes to the outputs that it comes to. We just stipulate. The explainability stuff is just, there's too many parameters, it's too complex, there's all sorts of reasons why the individual doctor can't understand it. The technologist can't understand it, and even if they did, the individual doctor with their individual expertise can't understand the diagnosis, given that it's drawing on all these other kinds of expertise. So suppose I take a case in which I just stipulate. You have very low understanding on the part of the doctor for why it gave the output that it did, why it made the diagnosis that it did. I stipulate that. I also stipulate that this thing is super reliable. It's more effective than the best doctors, let's just say. It's undergone all this testing and all these contexts, blah, blah, blah. In that case, it looks like, by your lights, informed consent is sacrificed. Sorry, informed consent can't be had. And so you have to either say, then informed consent should be overridden by virtue of the utility, or you have to say, I don't care how many lives it saves, we have to prioritize informed consent. Don't you have to run into that dilemma in that scenario?
I don't think so, because you can put it into the patient's hands to make that decision, right? You can say to the patient, this is the information we have. What is your decision in light of this information? And that is doing the best you can to promote the patient's autonomy, because you're putting the decision in their hands.
And the information that you're giving them is all the things that I just specified. This thing is super reliable, blah, blah, blah. Okay, but then it turns out that we don't need the doctor to serve as a conduit of information in order to secure informed consent.
Yeah. Okay, so one way of unpicking this thought experiment, I think it's very interesting, and I think it is putting the point, forcing us to confront the point. But I think one way of unpicking it is that what we mean when we say it's good, it's giving the right choices. So again, if the right choice, as we've been emphasizing, is always a combination of something that has a beneficial clinical outcome, but also one that's the right for the patient in line with the values they want to pursue. And if we stipulate that it'll just be able to do that, then I think we're imagining a world where, yes, we've managed to secure patient autonomy without having to worry very much about informed consent in the traditional sense. And if we stipulate that we reach that world, then I think, sure, it's probably fine to jettison informed consent, because at the end of the day, informed consent is invaluable just for its own sake. It's not just this ritual that we've all decided has this intrinsic value. It's because in the medical system we currently have, we believe that's the best way to promote patient autonomy. And we have lots of reasons why we think that jettison informed consent in the current medical system, that would severely hamper patient autonomy. But if we stipulate that an LLM is able to just predict patient preferences perfectly and always give whatever treatment would be in perfect alignment with those, it's just a very different world we're imagining then. And then in that case, I think, why stick to informed consent?
Yeah, I'm not sure that's right. I think you can still actually stick with informed consent. You just have to stop thinking that a necessary condition for informed consent is that the doctor be the one providing the information. about the rationale for the diagnosis. That's the main thing. Like, your thing is doctors need to understand the rationale, the evidence for the diagnosis. If they don't understand it, then they can't give that evidence to the patient, and then they can't give informed consent. So just give up that as a necessary condition for informed consent, and the doctor plays a different kind of role of providing information about, say, the reliability of the AI.
I'm not sure the framing of the issue is quite right. I think it's important to go back to why exactly informed consent has the role it does in clinical medicine, which is that historically doctors have exercised an inappropriate degree of paternalism, where the thought is something like, okay, the doctor thinks that X is in the patient's best interest, therefore the doctor is permitted to do X. And that has gone wrong in certain cases, such that the institutional norm of informed consent has evolved as a kind of safeguard to that sort of treatment of patients. If you ask, okay, in the current technological landscape, is it possible that patients could have values inappropriately imposed on them through the use of medical technologies? Absolutely, the answer is yes.
Sure.
And would informed consent be a good safeguard to that? Absolutely, the answer is yes.
Okay, that's super interesting stuff. I absolutely feel the pull of what you're saying. I also feel the pull of doctors are mechanics. And if you can fix the parts in some other way, and they're cool with having a different tool other than they don't need this mechanic, they need a different kind of mechanic, an AI mechanic, just use that instead. But obviously we're not there yet. It's big asterisk here, right? Until we're there, informed consent with flawed LLMs is going to be deeply important, at least for the foreseeable future, until we get to that sort of next stage of LLMs, if we get to that next stage of LLMs where they really are better than doctors at diagnosing.
Yeah, the bit of doctors at diagnosing and equally good at explaining their decisions in the right way. So in your hypothetical, you're imagining not just LLMs forming the task of making diagnostic suggestions and treatment suggestions and so on as well or better. You're also imagining that they're able to have dialogue with patients that faithfully interpret and integrate information about their values and preferences and priorities.
Right.
And I think that's the big if, and I think that won't come by magic. Once you can show me you've achieved it, I'll be very open to talking about that being good enough, but I would very much want to see the evidence for that claim.
Yeah, no, that's a nice point taken. I take it your point is, no, Reed, you can't view doctors as mere mechanics, because a mechanic fixing a car, the car doesn't have values and preferences, et cetera, a history, a background, goals, desires, hopes, fears, et cetera. But people do, patients do. And sure, call them a mechanic if you want, but it's a much more complicated thing than fixing a car. You're engaging with a human being with hopes, fears, desires, preferences, values, et cetera. And that function of a doctor is not to be understood mechanistically or something along those lines. And so if you're going to replace doctors in some major way using an LLM, then you have to understand that doctors do more than just turn the screws, so to speak, that they're engaged in a richer enterprise.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. I think we're on the same page, finally. All right, well, guys, thank you so much. This is super interesting stuff. Really great, interesting work. So thanks for coming on and talking about it.
Great.
Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you. Thanks for having us on.
Thanks so much, everyone, for listening. And now let me thank the people who have made this podcast possible. So first of all, we have Delano Alexander. He's been with me since day one. He showed me even how to start recording a podcast in the first place. He does editing stuff. He's been fantastic, and he does really everything I ask him to and more. I've never met anyone else who just says so much. Yeah, I don't know how to do that, but I'll figure it out. What more could you ask for in a producer? Next up, Jennifer Strong, my podcast guru. I don't know what else to call her. She just has advised me on how to design the podcast, how to grow it, and she's responsible for, if you like, this kind of season 2 relaunch and everything around it. So thank you to you, Jennifer. Next up, Meg Marco, responsible for all the excellent artwork. Before I did the artwork, I didn't really know what I was doing. We put it together. It worked well enough, but I think Meg really did a phenomenal job bringing everything together. Garrett Lang, sound engineer that I frankly don't deserve. He's just too good for this podcast. Don't tell him I said that, though. Next up, Benjamin Kultgen. He is a professor of philosophy who has helped me source guests, identify who's interesting, who has things to say, etc., etc. So without him, I wouldn't have anyone to talk to. And then finally, Ashley Wasilenko, who helps with all manner of administrative things, making sure that the podcast guests find their way to the podcast, can schedule the recording, get their bios and headshots, and really just keeping the show on the rails and me organized. Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate all your hard work.